Welcome back to Fungisphere. My name is Associate Professor Justin Beardsley and I'm based here at the Sydney Infectious Diseases Institute. It's a pleasure to welcome you back for the latest in our series of talks. For this talk, we welcome Lars Westblade from Weill Cornell University in the United States. He talks to us about his experience with the emergence of antifungal resistant pathogens in New York City and state, focusing on Candida auris and dermatophytes. It was a real pleasure to hear from him and we hope you'll enjoy the talk. We will make a start. It's my pleasure to introduce Lars Westblade. He's travelled far to be here today and share some of his experience with emergent antimicrobial resistance fungal pathogens. And I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic talk. So thank you, Lars, for joining us. I will shuffle off and let you take over.
Thank you so much, Justin. Great to be here. So my name's Lars, and I'm coming from Cornell Medical School in New York City. I checked if I could tell a joke before I start, and being a New Yorker, I want to tell you a bagel joke. So what do you call a bagel with wings?
A plain bagel.
A plain bagel.
Oh.
Terrible, terrible. I should leave now. It's a dad joke. It's a dad joke. So the title of my talk is Fungi Fight Back, Emerging Fungal Pathogens and Antifungal Resistance. Just for completion, my disclosures are here. I thought before I get into this talk, which is going to be case-based, I'll tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. So I'm awful with technology. Justin, you want to? There we go. So tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. I'm coming from New-York-Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center, which is a 862-bed academic medical center in New York City, right in the Upper East Side. We're the teaching hospital for Cornell, and we're part of a 10-campus hospital system that's in New York-Presbyterian. We are also in the same healthcare system as Columbia University, and my laboratory is the primary clinical microbiology lab for the eastern part of the healthcare system. We are a full-service lab, 24/7, bacteriology, mycology, molecular microbiology, and a few other subspecialties. So it's a great environment to be in. Just if I can give it a bit of a plug. We are, as I said, located in the Upper East Side, but we're also surrounded by a lot of other, I think, very good institutions. Cornell Tech, which is our kind of IT division, Hospital for Special Surgery, which is a huge orthopedic hospital, Memorial Sloan Kettering across the street, and also Rockefeller is also across the street. And then, of course, we also have interaction with Columbia University. So that's enough about my environment. I thought I'd launch into the talk now about the fungal kingdom, if I may. And I'm sure many people here don't need to be told of the importance of fungi, but I often give this talk to bacteriologists and virologists, so I like to center people with this slide. They're much more than eukaryotes. Much more than mushrooms. They are eukaryotes. They are Earth's degraders. They synthesize a limitless array of secondary metabolites. They're essential for human health in that respect, but they can cause life-threatening diseases in plants, animals, and humans. So they are important from a One Health perspective. Their clinical impact is becoming more and more compounded by the fact that there is an emergence of antifungal resistance. And I think that this paper by Denning and Lancet Infectious Diseases is profound because it basically tells us that fungal diseases account for greater than 6.5 million invasive and fungal infections and chronic pulmonary aspergillosis annually. We hadn't really thought about, at least where I am, about the importance of fungal infections. But this paper was very important, I believe, for the community. We're now starting to be popular. People understand fungi and fungal infections, and it's all, I think a lot of it is down, at least in the US, to this HBO series, The Last of Us, which is a post-apocalyptic drama that speaks about mass fungal infection with this particular fungus. And it's actually based on a real fungus, a neuroparasite of ants, known as the zombie ant fungus. And I think that this series has reignited a lot of interest in mycology, at least where I am. So I want to talk about two cases, but that speak to emerging fungal pathogens in New York State. I mean, they're emerging around the world, but New York State seems to be a focus for a lot of these fungal infections purely because of travel, I think, coming into and out of New York City. So just to remind you, this is New York State on the map of continental United States. So we'll move to our first case. And this is a homegrown case. This was a case of a 79-year-old male with a history of hypertension and CLL, treated approximately 15 years earlier, and myelodysplastic syndrome that had recently progressed to AML. He presented to our ED in March of 2016 with lethargy, bloody stools, intermittent right lower quadrant, abdominal pain, fever, and hypertension. He was treated with IV fluids and antibiotics. He required central venous access and vasopresses, and his blood cultures were positive for E. coli. So we'll march through his history with us. Hospital day 1, a CT revealed intussusception, and he was taken to the operating theater for colectomy. A peritoneal fluid culture was positive for E. coli, and so meropenem, a carbapenem, was initiated. He spent 12 days in the ICU. His course was complicated by acute renal failure requiring hemodialysis and persistent neutropenia, pancytopenia due to the AML. Hospital day 21, he had a chief complaint of feeling tired. He was concerned for these thick mucus secretions from his mouth and a persistent cough. His exam was notable for oral thrush. Clotrimazole was initiated, and it was noted that the patient had oral thrush during an outpatient visit 5 days prior to admission, and he was prescribed clotrimazole. Hospital day 22, the patient appeared lethargic. He received a dose of vancomycin. Day 23, he was more orientated, no new complaints, but still with this cough and a difficulty coughing up his secretions. A bunch of imaging studies were performed. Day 24, he remained afebrile. He had no new complaints, but blood cultures collected on day 22 were positive for yeast. Microfungum was initiated and additional blood cultures were collected. Day 25, blood cultures that were collected on day 24 were positive for VRE. Linaclid was initiated. He had no new symptoms or physical exam findings, but unfortunately his vital signs worsened, and on day 27 he died. So in our lab, the yeast that we recovered from the blood culture was identified as Candida species with a low probability using a biochemical-based system. Because it was a sterile site, we sent the isolate out to a reference lab for identification susceptibility testing. And just thinking about, we're talking about 2016 in New York City, and we've got a susceptibility profile here of a yeast that couldn't be readily identified using a biochemical system. So when I look at that susceptibility profile, I'm clearly drawn to the elevated MIC values with fluconazole, so I'll be thinking about things like Candida krusei, but that should be captured very readily with a biochemical-based system. Maybe even Candida glabrata, but again, that should be captured very nicely with this biochemical system. So just throwing it out there, I don't understand anyone in the chat. I can't monitor it, but what are you guys thinking? Yeast, fluconazole resistant. Got a clue? I can't hear you. Oh, that's a clue. No, it is a terrible clue, isn't it? Get out of here. That's what Justin's thinking. You're done. Okay, well, I'll just throw it out there. So again, highlighting that fluconazole, this was Candida auris. And this is one of the first documented cases of Candida auris in the United States. It was actually part of the MMWR write-up that the CDC put together, I think in 2016. And it took 22 days after the patient died to return identification, which is kind of poor. But it was because we had to send it out to a reference laboratory. So the isolate was actually confirmed by our state lab as a member of clade 1, and we'll talk about a little bit about that later. And then so that clade is associated with the Southern Asian origin. The interesting thing is that through the epidemiological investigation, the patient had no known travel or direct links to South Asia, suggesting local transmission. So a little bit about Candida auris. It was first described in 2009, recovered from the ear of a patient in Japan, hence the specific epithet auris. Earliest known clinical isolate, I believe, was recovered from a patient in 1996 in South Korea. What was very interesting in 2011, 2012, there was this kind of simultaneous observance of serious disease due to Candida auris in Asia, Africa, and South America. And the clinical cases were initially described in the United States in 2016, and through a retrospective look, the first case in New York City or in the United States was from 2013. And I think that was our sister institution, Columbia University, that had that isolate. Clinical cases have been reported in greater than 50 countries and all continents with the exception of Antarctica. I always have to put that in because someone likes to remind me of that. Global spread is linked to international travel, by persons with prior exposure to Candida auris in healthcare settings. In the US, there are hotspots, and we're aware of this. So California, Florida, Illinois, Nevada, obviously New York and New Jersey and Texas. And we look at the cases in New York State, and I took these data just before I came. Since January the 1st, 2013 to August the 16th, 2024, we've had just over 2,000 clinical cases. We've had about the same number of surveillance cases in New York State. Now, if you contrast that to, thank you to Sarah Kidd for providing these data. If you contrast that to Australia, I believe there have only been 49 total of clinical and surveillance cases since 2019. So you guys are doing a remarkable job at keeping Candida auris at bay. So there are 4 major Candida auris clades that have this global distribution. They have different areas of origin. I think there's now, well, actually correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's a clade 5 and a clade 6. Each clade differs from the other clades by a significant number of SNPs. In the US, all of these 4 clades have been described. I don't know about clade 5 and 6 being described in the US yet, but I think clades 1 through 4 have been, not think I know. And there have been multiple introductions into the United States. So Illinois, there have been introductions of particular, I think from South America. I think Indiana, the major introductions have been from South Africa. And in New York, the major introduction of Candida auris has been from Southern Asia. They seem to have, the clades seem to have different propensities for colonization and outbreaks. I think that's kind of fascinating about this organism, that there seems to be this genetic diversity that leads to that. So I know that definitely folks at the CDC are very interested in understanding that more. The wonderful thing, well, it's not wonderful, but I think the fascinating thing about Candida auris is that it just has this remarkable ability just to persist. You can't get rid of it. It forms these biofilms and can just hang out in a healthcare environment. The colonization of skin, hospital service, medical instruments allows it to readily spread throughout healthcare facilities. And a lot of facilities, including my own, we don't screen patients coming in, but we definitely, if we recover Candida auris from a patient, often that will prompt some type of surveillance of the unit to understand how, if it's being transmitted within the unit. 5 to 10% of patients that are colonized will develop fungemia. It causes, as we might imagine, these deeply invasive infections in those patients that have been hospitalized for long periods of time, that are immunosuppressed. The reported in-hospital mortality rates range between 25 to 70%. And clades 1 and 4, at least to the best of my knowledge, appear to exhibit the greatest virulence. Clade 2, which was the isolate that is primarily associated with ear infections. So it's not really thought to be as pathogenic as the other clades. And clades 3 and 4 are the better colonizers, if you will. They seem to be genetically endowed with the machinery to persist on the skin and in the environment. In terms of the microbiology, it's part of this larger clade. And I think of pretty nasty yeasts. The characteristics, notable things I want you to take away from here is that it's a thermotolerant organism, and it's also halotolerant. It loves salt and it loves elevated temperatures. What does it look like? It's pretty nondescript. It forms these kind of narrow-based budding yeast that can be slightly elongated compared to other Candida species. There have been reports of it forming rudimentary pseudohyphae. Biochemical systems are notoriously awful at identifying it, as we noted with our case. I think that's been improved with the recognition of Candida auris, but fortunately, methods like mass spectrometry have saved the day and accurately identify Candida auris. Sequencing-based methods too, but most labs don't have the ability to do sequencing in their day-to-day service. There are some biochemicals and growth characteristics that can allow you to differentiate it from other closely related species, notably its ability to be susceptible to cyclohexamide. How have we, in my own institution, kept Candida auris at bay? I would say that we do mass spectrometry on every single yeast, regardless of the clinical specimen. We send the yeast isolate for mass spec. If it's Candida auris, we'll report it out, Candida auris, regardless of the specimen, even if it's urine, even if it's sputum, and we'll perform susceptibility testing. Of course, if it's not Candida auris, we'll follow our culture and specimen-specific procedures. And obviously, a yeast from sputa is not significant with the exception of Cryptococcus, but Candida auris, if it comes from a sputum, will get reported out. And I think that has been really, really important at keeping our kind of prevalence of Candida auris low in our institution. It's kind of a seeking, well, it's not really an active seeking and destroying type of mechanism, but we're tuned on to trying to get it out. So Candida morphology, and this is where I really want to tell you some new news, I think. So when we think about how Candida looks in tissue, what does Candida look like in tissue? There's kind of two flavors, if you will. You've got Candida glabrata on the right-hand side here, which just forms narrow-base budding yeast. And then you've got Candida albicans and other Candida species where they'll form budding yeast, so-called blastoconidia, true hyphae and pseudo hyphae, those sausage links, if you will. Putting together some literature on Candida auris, I started to wonder, what does Candida auris actually look like in tissue? When we grow in culture, it's budding yeast, but then there's these reports of having these rudimentary pseudo hyphae. So we're fortunate enough, well, that's the right word, we're unfortunate. We had some horrible cases where folks had actually passed away from Candida auris, but we had tissue. And so this is a case where we had a 58-year-old male with a history of IV drug use, Hep C, heart failure, CKD, and basically he succumbed to his infection and mitral valve was sent to the pathology lab for examination. And this is what was observed. And I hope you can appreciate it. Have I got a pointer here? Yeah, you've got the budding yeasts here, but you've also, I hope you can appreciate that you're seeing lots of sausage links in there. So at least in this example, Candida auris has the ability to elicit pseudohyphae, which I don't think had been clearly documented. So we're in the process of doing a case review and trying to pull more of these cases and describe how Candida auris looks in tissue. In terms of why is Candida auris so feared? Because it does seem to have this property of being multi-drug resistant. But still to this day, even in the US, echinocandins are the mainstay of treatment. The interesting thing is that antifungal resistance appears to vary among clades. And so that tells us that resistance with this organism is acquired and not intrinsic. So I hope you can appreciate here that if you compare clades 1 and 2, you can notice that if we look at the fluconazole susceptibility, you can see that almost 100% of clade 1 isolates are resistant to fluconazole, whereas clade 2, which is supposedly that puny clade, does not really have fluconazole resistance. That all being said, there have been reports of transmission of echinocandin resistant and pan-resistant isolates in the US. I haven't personally seen in my lab yet an echinocandin resistant isolate, but I'm sure other institutions in New York State have seen. In fact, I'm not sure I know. When we think about resistance to the main antifungals, of course, we think about the azoles, fluconazole. Just to remind you, the azoles inhibit ergosterol biosynthesis, specifically by inhibiting lanosterol 14-alpha demethylase. How does Candida auris become resistant? It generates mutations in the target. You can also have increased expression of the target and also efflux of fluconazole. In terms of the polyenes, amphotericin being the main member of that class, Candida auris seems to have developed a number of mechanisms to become resistant to amphotericin. I don't think any of them are truly well defined, but I've listed some of them there for completion. And then finally, the echinocandins, though when resistance is observed, it's due to point mutations in the target of the echinocandins, notably in beta-1,3-D-glucan synthase. So where does Candida auris come from? And I think it's kind of fascinating to think about it, and it's definitely centers you in thinking about a One Health perspective. It's been recovered from the environment. We know that. So it suggests that there is an environmental source of clinical isolates. If you think about an organism in the environment, it's constantly being insulted. It's being exposed to fluctuations in temperature, humidity, also being preyed upon by other microorganisms, amoeba. If you're being preyed upon by amoeba, you're learning how to survive in an intracellular environment, potentially. So the environment basically selects for these virulence traits that has allowed it to become a human pathogen. And then we think about Candida auris isolates that are in the environment don't tolerate temperature so well, but the clinical isolates do. So maybe this hypothesis of global warming that has allowed Candida auris to break the so-called endothermy barrier and become a human pathogen. So that's the end of my Candida auris case. I'm going to move on to another emerging pathogen, and this is very recent, this case. So this is a case of an 11-year-old male who presented with a rash for 1 year, and he presents to our AD in February of 2023. Just showing you some of the images of the groin rash, and on his cheek he has a rash. He developed a rash in the US and then moved to Bangladesh for a year. During that time, he was treated with a variety of medications, including antifungals. His symptoms improved, but not completely resolved. And of note, his brother has a similar rash. Presents to our ED, he was given Benadryl and hydrocortisone. In March of 2023, so a month later, he presents to our dermatology service. Fortunately, they send a skin scraping as opposed to doing nothing, so we actually get specimen to culture. And he was treated with topical ketoconazole. In our lab, we observed fungal elements in the clinical specimen. An organism, a mold, was recovered in culture. And like a good mycologist, I want to show you the front and the reverse of what you're seeing here. So on the top, you're seeing the, oh, let me go back. You're seeing a nice, fluffy, downy organism. My former microfellow, who's now my co-director at Weill Cornell, likes to think of this as snow. So this isn't any type of snow that you would ever want to jump into. And on the reverse, you can see there's no real pigmentation. So when we did our tape prep, we noted these, what we call birds on a wire, hyphal elements with tiny little microconidia projecting off the side. So we felt we were dealing with a Trichophyton. That's usually our click key, that we're dealing with Trichophyton. And then we noticed these beautiful cigar-shaped macroconidia. So we were clued into the fact that potentially this is a Trichophyton mentogrophytes. But because a certain clinical microbiologist was getting more and more interested in mycology, and that would be me, I called the state lab and said, this went into the chart and noted that this patient had had these lesions for about a year, which just seemed crazy with the treatment that they were also receiving. And so they took the isolate. They were able to perform molecular identification and susceptibility testing. I'll show you that susceptibility testing here. And really what I want to draw your attention to is the terbinafine. Yeah, I said it correctly. I usually say it incorrectly. Terbinafine MIC values. Lots of kids laughing at me. And so the MIC value was greater than 128 micrograms per mil. And there are no known breakpoints for terbinafine, but anything based on distribution between, did I say it incorrectly now? I did, right. There are no known breakpoints, but anything that's kind of considered greater than 0.5 micrograms per mil, kind of associated with treatment failure. And look at our patients' MIC value. It's ridiculous. So I'll just throw it out there for fun. If you were me and you were thinking about, you've got this 11-year-old who's had a lesion, rashes for about a year on the cheek, groin, recalcitrant to therapy, looks like a Trichophyton mentogrophytes. Any thoughts? Yeah, absolutely. So Trichophyton indotineae, but we thought 22 days took a long time to get an identification of Candida auris. It ultimately took 13 months from the onset of symptoms to identification of Trichophyton indotineae for this patient, which is insane. And I can't help it's probably in part that dermatologists are not used to sending culture. Fortunately, he came to our dermatology service where they're very good at getting cultures. Often dermatophytosis is just diagnosed and treated without sending anything for culture and identification. So a little bit about dermatophytes. They're personally my favorite group of fungi because they love you more than you love yourself because they want to eat you. And that's because they love keratin. And they are among the few fungi that have evolved a dependency on humans or animals for survival. They are among the most common infectious agents on the planet. And not speaking broadly about taxonomy, I still like to keep it that there are 3 main genera of dermatophytes: Microsporum, Trichophyton, and Epidermophyton. I think that's blown up to, what, 7 or 9 different genera. We're slow in the US. We'll get there one day with the taxonomy. The interesting thing is, and I don't know what it's like in Australia, that many medical mycology labs do not or cannot identify dermatophytes to the genus, let alone the species level. That's a problem when you're dealing with something like Trichophyton indotineae. A number of medical microbiology labs might simply say dermatophyte isolated, not even moving into what genus it is. We give it a good stab and try and get it down to the genus and species if we can. Dermatophytosis, we think about it not really being, well, I ignorantly used to think about it not being a significant ailment, but it is. It can cause severe discomfort, work absenteeism, decreased quality of life. So it's not to be sniffed at. It's the disease as a result of the host reaction to the fungal cell wall. The disease is designated based on the specific body part that's affected. Our patient, if I recall, groin, face, and I also think ended up having on the trunk as well. So a little bit about Trichophyton indotineae microbiology. So again, relatively recently emerged organism. 2016, there were these reports of chronic recalcitrant dermatophytosis in India. And this organism was ultimately designated a species only in 2020. It was originally designated Trichophyton mentogrophytes genotype 8, which just runs off the tongue, right? And from a retrospective review from the lab in San Antonio, the first terbinafine resistant isolate in the US was documented from 2017. So it had been in the US not long after it had been noted in India. It's a member of the Trichophyton mentogrophytes species complex. And this is where the rub comes, because by definition, if you're a species complex, you're morphologically phenotypically identical, but you're genetically distinct. I just told you that most labs in the United States can barely get by with getting an organism, a dermatophyte, down to the genus level. So what are we supposed to do in the era of Trichophyton indotineae, where, in my opinion, it's very important to pull it out from other members of the Trichophyton mentogrophytes complex? We think potentially urease activity might help us. So it's in our lab, it's a rule that any Trichophyton, if we suspect it's Trichophyton, we set up a urease slant. So Trichophyton indotineae is notable, at least I believe in most part, for having a negative urease reaction, whereas other members of the mentogrophytes complex are positive. So this could be one way, and this is the way that we use in our lab to screen Trichophyton for sending to the Trichophyton species, for sending them to the state for molecular identification. I do believe that the manufacturers of the major mass spectrometry instruments are building Trichophyton indotineae into their databases, so it should be able to be identified using mass spec. What about the infection? It's typified. Trichophyton indotineae infections are typified by these highly inflammatory plaques on the body, groin, and face, as our patient had. Treatment is typically recalcitrant to a number of the antifungals that are typically used to treat tinea. I mentioned that the suspected origin is Southeast Asia, but due to global migration, we are seeing it around the world, including North America and also Australia, if I believe. Yes. And how did it arise? I'm always fascinated with how these things get into our population. Well, probably it's driven by the use of the over-the-counter steroid antifungal creams. I never think it's a great idea if you've got a steroid and an antifungal together. You've got the steroid suppressing the local cellular immunity, then you've got antifungal. You're just asking for antifungal resistance. And so I would say, and this is really my plea to really a lot of the US labs that, and also physicians, I'm sure it's different in Australia, but always just encourage people that if they suspect Trichophyton indotineae based on clinical presentation or travel history, to send the culture. And the microlab should be clued on to being aware of pulling out Trichophyton indotineae from other Trichophyton species. And I think that urease reactivity could be useful. So how does it become resistant to terbinafine? Just to remind you again, Terbinafine inhibits the ergosterol biosynthetic pathway, specifically squalene epoxidase enzyme. And when we have looked at isolates that are resistant to the amines terbinafine, it's usually a point mutation. And our patient's isolate had a point mutation in squalene epoxidase that is the most common point mutation associated with resistance in Trichophyton indotineae. This mutation is associated with elevated MIC values to terbinafine. And of note that these resistant infections often require prolonged treatment with second-line therapy, such as itraconazole. So as a part of this case, we got together talking with other microbiologists and dermatologists in New York City, notably Avram Kaplan and Sudha at the Department of Health in New York State. And we wanted to describe what are we actually seeing with Trichophyton indotineae in New York City. And so it's a descriptive study that was recently published. It's only of 11 patients, but that's really all we had at the time. And 9 of the patients actually had reported travel to Bangladesh within the last 2 years. There was no travel for 1 patient, which suggests that there is local transmission. So it's within the city now and being transmitted locally. For 1 patient, there was no travel history was obtained. When those isolates were whole genome sequenced, they all clustered together, and they all seem to cluster differently from the Indian isolates. So suggesting that this clade is distinct and Bangladesh is distinct from the Indian isolates. So how did our patient do? So presented in February 2023. In April, he was followed up with the Dermatology Service, and his therapy was switched to griseofulvin. In May 2023, his facial lesion had resolved, but his body lesions had progressed. So itraconazole was initiated, 100 mg twice daily, a topical ketoconazole. Just showing you some of those images there. You can see the progression from February when he initially presented, then May, you're seeing his some of the lesions. So the groin lesions there, and the facial lesion had ultimately resolved. In June 2023, his itraconazole was continued for a total of 12 weeks. So this is a significant amount of time at treating this young man. In July, he left for boarding school in India. He was lost to follow-up, but notably, per Pediatric Infectious Diseases note, he seemed to be improving on itraconazole. And I think that's an important point because, as I'll get to in a second. Of note, his brother was also infected with Trichophyton indotineae. Both had traveled to Bangladesh from the prior 2 years. And from the whole genome sequencing, they were the exactly same isolate. How often do you actually see this when there was no difference whatsoever between 2 isolates recovered from 2 patients? So they had been giving it to each other. And when that was probably a little bit more, they did share a bed, apparently. And so they were probably co-infecting one another. The susceptibility testing results were almost identical, with the exception that the itraconazole was slightly different between the 2. Of note, our patient's isolate, the 11-year-old brother, his MIC value to itraconazole was elevated. I think anything above 0.25 is considered not so great. Our patient's isolate had an itraconazole MIC value of 0.5, but he was improving on therapy, and I think that's an important point. So in our descriptive study of 11 patients, there is hope. It seems that itraconazole will treat Trichophyton indotineae, at least in the US isolates that we've experienced. So there's been concern, as you might imagine, that are we arriving at a period where we can't treat dermatophytosis readily? So I think that's an important point. So that's the end of my cases, and I'm just going to summarize with something I stole off Sarah. Final thoughts about emergent antifungal, antimicrobial resistant fungi. They are a reminder that fungi are important. As a bacteriologist, primarily through my clinical service, I would often not really think about antifungal resistance, but I've been humbled with Candida auris and now with Trichophyton indotineae. And if we continue as humans to do the stupid things that we do, plop fungicides everywhere and use agricultural azoles, we're asking for problems. We all know about pan-azole resistant Aspergillus fumigatus, not only from horticulture in Europe, but also within the United States, particularly associated with peanut farming. We're seeing a lot of azole-resistant Aspergillus species. So I just want to acknowledge a few folks. I always like to, the folks in black colored text have been very good to me in the world of mycology. Full disclaimer, I'm not a mycologist. I've kind of got myself into this field. I always highlight the folks in blue. They are my bosses, one better word. They would never want to be known that. But Max Loder, Melissa Cushing, and Neil Lindemann. And actually, Max today, he's our chairman of pathology, just got nominated to the National Academy of Medicine. So I sent him a text and he said, I'll enjoy a Negroni with you when you get back. So we'll have a Negroni together. But last but not least, I do want to give a shout out to Devise Lerone. She was the mycologist at Cornell for a good 10, 15 years. And way back before I was born, wrote the first edition of what is now known as Lerone's Medically Important Fungi. I think the first edition was published 75 or 76. And just to tell you a little bit about Devise's story, she was not a PhD or an MD microbiologist. She started out as a medical lab scientist, worked as a medical lab scientist for many years, 20 years or so. And ultimately, she didn't even know mycology, but she tells a story that her mycologist was leaving for holiday and she needed to run the lab. She was a supervisor. She said, well, how do you identify them? She said, well, I look at the colors on the surface, I look at the colors on the reverse, and then I group them. And then I do my tape preps. She said, that's great. Why not write a book that's designed to do that? And that's exactly how Lerone's is designed, that you don't really even need to know mycology in order to make an identification, because you're looking at the colony morphology and color and then doing your microscopic identification. But so Devise is a wonderful individual, and I'm very grateful to her. And thanks to you guys for listening to me.
Away from the hot seat, but I'm going to rearrange the technology so that we can see people who are got questions. We have a couple. Do you want to relay those questions whilst I change the?
And this is a group effort for the questions.
So, do you want me to read it? So, is Candida auris notifiable in the States?
Yeah, we have to look, at least I can only speak for New York State, but we have to send every single isolate to the Department of Health. I think now we have to send one isolate per patient. But at the beginning, we were just sending everything we recovered from patients. Yeah.
So during the period of admission pass or one episode patient?
Yeah, now I think it's one episode per patient. Yeah. Because it was getting a little bit too much when you have these patients in house and their blood cultures are constantly positive.
And the next question is, what method do you use for antifungal susceptibility testing?
Yeah, we use the Thermo Fisher yeast 1 panels for susceptibility testing.
Which is what most of the laboratories in New South Wales and in Australia use.
Although,
Vitec, a lot of them use Vitec.
Vitec. I have heard, and I could be wrong, so maybe don't quote me, that amphotericin and Candida auris do not gel well with the Thermo Fisher system. So a lot of labs who are doing Candida auris susceptibility testing are doing gradient diffusion, E-test for amphotericin, and taking the rest of the antifungals from the yeast 1 panel. Am I correct in, is that a known issue with ampho on the yeast 1 panel?
Amphotericin's always been meant to be better on the solid media.
Okay. See, I'm showing my ignorance. I'm displaying my ignorance. Look at that. I'm not a mycologist.
I have a David. I think you could unmute and question.
If you insist, Justin.
Thank you, David.
That's really interesting. So I'm a plant pathologist and work with Justin and some others on the risks associated with using demethylase inhibitor fungicides or azoles in agriculture as well as in medicine. So, I guess the question is, well, the simplest thing would be just to ban the use of DMI fungicides in agriculture, but that could risk food insecurity. So it's not quite that simple. What do you suggest we do to try and reduce the risk of human failure of medicines and to guarantee food security?
Wow. See, I spoke of my arrogance, didn't I, of not thinking about this. I don't know, one point, should we be using the same class of compounds in agriculture that we use in medicine? It's like, often wonder about, shouldn't there be kind of agricultural specific compounds as opposed to, you know, using everything for humans and animals and plants? I don't know. Any other thoughts? I mean, your point is valid, very, very valid.
Well, Australia is one of the few countries in the world where antibiotics are not used in crop protection, but everywhere else in the world they are. So we're aware of those risks. We can do it in Australia because we don't have, or we have better ways of managing bacterial diseases in crops. But fungal diseases, farmers are heavily dependent on DMI fungicides.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you raising it because I don't usually think about it.
I think one of the difficulties, David, and we've spoken about this a lot, one of the difficulties is that it's so hard to find agents that are not toxic to humans, but are toxic to fungi. And when you find one that's something like an azole, then it's very easy and convenient for farmers to use because it doesn't matter if they contact it or they inhale it a bit. Whereas something that you say, oh, we can easily strictly reserve this for agricultural use because it's toxic to humans. A, it's contaminating the food chain, and B, it's that occupational hazard for the poor farmer. So I think it's really tough. And whenever you find an agent class that is not going to be poisonous to the farmer, it's probably going to be a pretty good human antifungal therapeutic as well.
Well, of course, animals are just evolved fungi. But one of the other thoughts I had.
Sorry, Momta has we have a potential other answer online that would be good to get into the discussion. So Momta, would you like to go ahead?
Hi, I'm Mamta. I'm working at Covity and I work on rust fungus. And we have identified few rust fungus which are resistant to DMI and other fungicides. And what we found was we were trying to have something we can recommend it to the farmers. So I work on plant. So what we did was we tried to evaluate some compound fungicide, and then we found some resistant strains of barley leaf rust, wheat leaf rust, and even stripe rust. So what we did was we did some tests on plants, and then we found compound fungicide like DMI plus SDHI, and those could control this fungicide. But because they have this rates, low field rate and high field rate, which they use it in their field. So basically, low field rate, they cannot control that insensitive strain. And what we found was at high field rate, if they use high field rate in their field, it could arrest the growth of that strain. So we were recommending them to use a compound fungicide in their field, although it is spread out all over Australia right now for the rust insensitive fungus.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Adam. That's great. Do we have any other questions in the room or online? Sharon?
So just about this important questions about agricultural fungicides, the National Australia and New Zealand Mycosis Interest Group has had some discussions with the, I can't remember which department it was, the ones that actually spray fungicides in the environment, you know, the government. Yes. And they are looking into their use of fungicides, particularly into the use of ipclufenaquin, which is a cousin of olorofin, which is one of our newest antifungals. And this has been highlighted. This has been taken up by the president of ACID as well, and the advocacy group. So certainly the question of agricultural use is not being ignored, but we're looking to work more closely with the approvals group.
Okay. Thanks, Sharon. Ruth?
Thanks, Justin. Just trying to find the buttons and hoping that we can get through this before your computer runs out of juice. Its battery looks a bit low.
Thanks for noticing. I'm very anxious.
Yeah, I'm not a mycologist, although I know some. I work more with bacteria, and then I also hang out a little bit with people that do viruses. Virus people routinely seem to sequence entire viromes, finding 100,000 viruses per milligram of soil using artificial intelligence. The bacteriologists are at the stage where they can put colonies through a mini in their own lab within a day of isolating it. When will sequencing, next generation sequencing, become routine in mycology? And what's needed to make that happen?
I will provide an answer, but you are in the presence of real mycologists who should probably answer. I would say that every Candida auris isolate that we send to the Department of Health gets sequenced. And they're also sequencing Trichophyton indotineae. I recognize that we probably haven't given the same attention to fungi as we should have in terms of sequencing, but I think we're at that time, at least at the public health level. I don't know, you are the mycology experts. What do you?
As we very high-tech change the camera angle here.
I like that. Just you've never looked so good. Look at that.
So from Katrina, would you like to have a go?
Oh, well, we also do whole genome sequencing of the odd. We don't get very many Candida auris, but certainly they are sequenced. We haven't got to that with indotineae. We have sequenced kind of clusters, outbreaks of various Candidas, but it is certainly not routine yet. And I think that will be, that's a few years off.
And I think we at SA Pathology are sequencing every Candida auris and Trichophyton indotineae. We're also in the process of actually replacing our routine ITS sequencing with whole genome sequencing. So basically any isolate that we can't identify easily will get whole genome sequencing. So I think that's a starting point where we might end up sequencing everything potentially. But at the moment it's because it costs about the same as ITS sequencing and gives us a lot more information, actually. Just to support what Katrina and Sarah have brought up, and Ruth, you asked a very good question. It's a question of economics. It's a question of governance. And in New South Wales, we have a very complex system of governance. We will certainly sequence if there's an outbreak or if there is a question of uncertain identity, but it's not as routine as, say, Salmonella or SARS-CoV-2. Needs to be worked into the workflow, and the logistics of combining bacteria with fungi and viruses with fungi. We don't combine them because of technical problems, so they need to be done as standalone. So yes, we are behind the bacteriologists and certainly behind the virologists.
That's great. So what I'm hearing is some technical challenges, but mostly political or governance and economic challenges.
Yes.
Thank you.
Welcome any suggestions.
Suggestions on a postcard addressed to Sharon Chen, please. If we have maybe time for one more question, if there's anyone who would like to raise a finger. A hand? Sorry. That's entirely incorrect.
Depends what string you'd like to raise.
Wow, apologies. David, your hand is raised.
Yeah, look, just one other thought, going back to my earlier question. So for dermatophytes, this might sound quaint, but for dermatophytes, there's something called Whitfield's ointment, I think, which is benzoic and salicylic acid. And it works pretty well on dermatophytes. Wouldn't one approach be, rather than prescribing a DMI fungicide for treatment, to be using something more general like Whitfield's ointment.
Well, you're in the presence of infectious diseases physician, so I'll not to turf it. I'm not. I don't see patients.
I mean, for my 2 cents worth on that, it's just typically not very effective at getting rid of eradicating the infection. Partly because nobody is able to comply with such a onerous treatment. It's multiple times of application per day for months, and it's really, really difficult to get people to do that. Taking a tablet is easier. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Well, it's a bit like in agriculture. You could recommend that farmers use copper fungicides, but I guess the economics they're not as effective, so the economics isn't as attractive.
It's also sometimes you need to go to a compounding pharmacy to get the formulations worked out than an ordinary pharmacy, and this requires multiple strips and costs to be met before the compounding pharmacy will do it. I don't know what it's like in the States.
I have no idea.
I think one of the things that it's great that you brought up the whole One Health topic. And I think people have spoken a bit about governance as well, and the advocacy that's going on at the moment to get more voices in the rooms where the decisions are made, really. And I know Dave Rue spoke about this as well, that when you're approving pesticides for use in agriculture, it would be helpful to have people who understand some of the human health implications, at least so it can be factored into the decision. It's not to say that the final decision will be that this needs to be protected for human health, but at least the human health angle would be considered, I think. Okay, well.
Can I conclude with a joke?
Please.
A bagel joke?
Yeah.
I'm not sure this one's
That's not the same one, though, right?
No, it should be. Okay, so I hope this one comes across. It's a bit of a New Yorkism. How do you stop your bagels from getting away from you, Justin?
I'm a funny person, I don't know.
Someone
Put a leash on them.
But you put locks on them. Locks, salmon locks, smoked salmon, LOX. Oh, terrible, terrible. Get out of here, Lars Westblade. Got a thumbs up. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed the talk. If you're interested in hearing more from us, please sign up or just keep following us here for more great content.